Sure.
Let's see. Yeah, we are live. Let me see here. Did you grow up in the Maryland area?
Yep, born and raised in Baltimore.
Oh, that's awesome. And then when did you move to North Carolina?
So I went to school up in Rochester, New York, RIT. Then post-college, about 2010, moved down here permanently, haven't left since.
Okay. So you like it, I guess you like it better than Maryland area.
Yeah, I'd say so.
What do you like about it specifically?
Well, I like the cost of living. I like the fact that we have access to everything. You know, we're fairly cosmopolitan in this area. We're not missing anything. It's not like a rural place, but it's still very affordable. It's on the up and up. You know, whereas Rochester, New York, where I went to college, was Rust Belt. It was in the decline. Weather's nice. It's good for me because my parents are still in Baltimore, so it's not too far away. You know, I can visit for holidays and stuff without having to fly across the country.
Yeah, that's cool. Sounds great. I feel like especially for people in IT, finding places with low cost of living is awesome.
Oh yes,
we can mostly work remote, so then makes our lives much easier.
Yeah, definitely. It'll be really interesting to see the trend that happens with where people live in the IT industry because of coronavirus and everybody having to work from home, or companies being open to remote work. It'll be interesting to see if there are these like mass exoduses out of the Northeast and out of California and Washington to just, you know, random places around the country like Florida, North Carolina, Kansas, you know, where people can, you know, get more house, get more yard,
yeah,
stretch
exactly.
that dollar.
Yeah, you just got to make sure the internet is fast there.
Yep.
I see we got someone saying they are from Argentina.
Cool.
Welcome from Welcome, Lucas. What time is it in Argentina right now? It might take him a little bit to answer. Andy is from North Carolina, and I'm from Florida. They're actually pretty close, probably like 8-hour drive.
Yep.
8 p.m. Oh, nice. Well, thanks for joining us in your evening, Lucas. I mean, I know Andy's gonna have some awesome stuff for you guys to learn.
It's pretty cool that you get people from around the world for these live streams.
Yeah, it's cool, right?
It's awesome.
It's nice. Yeah. Usually we will also get a lot of people from India to UK and Europe, but right now this time doesn't work well for the European people, you know, unless they're late night owls. Hey everybody, welcome. We'll be starting in a few minutes. While you're joining in the chat, feel free to let us know where you're from. Hey everyone, welcome. We'll be starting in like 2 minutes. Feel free to let us know in the chat where you're from. We found out that me and Andy, we both grew up in the same area, both from Maryland.
Small world.
Yeah, right. Give it about 1 more minute. We'll be starting. Okay, cool. Let's go ahead and get started. Well, welcome everyone to Behavior-Driven Pragmatism with Andy Knight. In this talk, we will cover 3 quality-centric behavior-driven practices that can help any team develop better software. And let me tell you all a little bit about Andy Knight. He is the Automation Panda, an engineer, consultant, and international speaker who loves all things about software. His main passion is building solutions for software testing problems. He has designed and built robust test automation solutions for operating systems, service APIs, and web apps, with thousands of tests running continuously. He also mentors others on good development, testing, and BDD practices, and currently works full-time as lead software engineer in test at Precision Lender, a Q2 company. Reach his tech blog at automationpanda.com and follow him on Twitter at automationpanda. So that's Andy, and now I will let you take over the show.
Great. Thanks so much, Nikolay. And hello, everybody from around the world. I'm super thankful to be here. Thankful to Ultimate QA. And like I said, Nikolay, to give me the opportunity to share a little bit tonight about behavior-driven development, and specifically from a pragmatic perspective. So as you've already heard, my name is Andrew Knight. You can also call me Pandy for short. That's what people tend to call me in the Python community. I am a software engineer and test. I build solutions to testing problems. Right now, I do that at Precision Lender, which is a Q2 company. I'm located in Cary, North Carolina. I love it here. So feel free after this talk to reach out to me or to follow me. You can check out my blog at automationpanda.com, as well as follow me on Twitter at automationpanda. So as we said, tonight we're going to talk about BDD. Does anyone out there know what BDD stands for? You probably do, but maybe you don't. This BDD I'm going to talk about for the next 2 minutes is buzzword-driven development. I hate buzzword-driven development. When we're in software, we get inundated with a barrage of these buzzwords on all these different topics all the time. I'm going to hit you with some of them right now. Automation, shift left, agile, test-driven, parallel, pyramid, continuous, artificial intelligence. Sometimes we've got pythons and cucumbers and panda bears and smart bears. Oh my goodness, that's a lot of buzzwords. Just make the DevOps happen. Let's pause. Let's stop. Why are there so many of these buzzwords? Anytime we have problems, we try to develop solutions to them. And when some people find some pretty good solutions to problems, they try to find a way to market what those solutions are to help other people. And buzzwords effectively became this big, long game of telephone, where something works here, and they try it there, and they try it there. But as it trickles through different communities or different organizations or teams, the meanings behind those buzzwords sometimes don't stick. And sometimes leaders will try to do things not because the changes they're trying to implement will bring value to the work they're doing or to the teams they're leading, but rather because someone else was doing it and it was the new hot buzzword, and maybe because they're doing it, we should do it too. So what I want to do is say, stop. Buzzwords don't solve problems. Pragmatic people solve problems. Buzzwords can be helpful for trying to communicate certain ideas around, but let's not get caught up in buzzwords. And so I say this at the beginning because I believe BDD, or behavior-driven development, has become a buzzword of the 2010s and the 2020s. A lot of companies, as much as they were trying to do agile transformations in the past decade or two, now companies are trying to do BDD transformations, or they're trying to Gherkinize their test automation code. And so when I see this, a lot of companies are just adopting rote practices like using a framework like Cucumber, or forcing everyone to rewrite manual test cases in Gherkin, given when-then syntax. And they're not doing it with purpose, and they're not focusing on what problems their organizations actually have. So what I want to do in my introduction to BDD for y'all, not buzzword-driven development, but behavior-driven development, I don't want to define what BDD is to me and then just throw a bunch of buzzwords in your face in the next half hour. Rather, what I want to do is I want to look at three software development problems together and see why they are problems and what we can do to bring solutions to those problems to help improve the way in which we handle these problems. And from that, we'll see and build what true behavior-driven development is. So let's look at our first problem, miscommunication. Buzzwords already do a pretty good job of that, but we'll forward. Take a look at this. Does anybody recognize what this is? You may have seen this before. This is the infamous project cartoon. After this talk, you can Google it, go to Google or Yahoo or whatever search engine you want, project cartoon, and you'll probably see something like this. When we look at the different things in here, we find humor in it. Let's start in the top left here. How the customer explained what they wanted, some 3-level swing. How the project leader understood it, a swing that totally knocks him to the trunk. How the analyst designed it, it cut the tree in half, right? And so we see progressively all these funny situations that show ways in which something was misunderstood or misinterpreted. I think it's funny how the customer's build was like an amusement park and how it was supported was nothing, right? But then we look towards, the bottom right. What did the customer actually need? What they needed was just a fun swing off of a tree and something with a little bit of character, like a tire swing, right? Why did that get miscommunicated so badly so that you're chopping your tree in half or just straight up chopping it down, right? Miscommunication. When we work in software, a lot of times the things that we're developing are not as simple as a tree swing, right? Sometimes, and I should say oftentimes, we're dealing with fairly complicated kinds of software applications. They could be things like, loan processing for a bank or a social media platform, right? Things with lots and lots of behaviors, lots of ways to interact with it, lots of users. So it can be very, very complicated very quickly. And it can be very, very difficult to communicate the nuances of what is desired in the behaviors of our software to all the different roles, because every role has a different perspective on how that thing should be developed. That's why we find humor in all these different slides, because how the programmer wrote it looks different from how the business consultant described it, because there are certain perspectives that each of those roles have that would lead to possible types of miscommunications, right? So miscommunication is a huge, huge problem within the software world. It's a huge problem in the world in general, but narrowing down, it's a huge problem within the software space. And I'm sure if you've spent any time on a software team in whatever role, developer, tester, manager, I'm sure you've had instances where things were misunderstood and miscommunicated and time was wasted because of it. One of the major sources of that miscommunication is that division of roles, right? If we reduce the roles into categories of what we would find on a software development team, there's essentially three primary roles. The business role, which is usually something like a business analyst or a product owner, the folks who are talking with the end users and the customers and figuring out what needs to be developed. What is the product that we're building? What are the features that go into this product? And why do the users need those things? That would be the responsibility of a business role. You then have the development role, something like a developer or a software engineer. The developers don't necessarily answer what the product will be, but rather how the product will be built. Developers, fingers on keyboard, they're banging out code, right? Goes into continuous integration, boop, out comes your software artifact that you can deploy or install, right? Developers are building those behaviors. And then the third primary role would be that of test. Your tester, whether that's a manual tester or an automation engineer, or you call them a software engineer in test, or maybe it could just be another developer who's taking on some test-oriented work. That's still a tester role. The testers are there to make sure that the behaviors and the products and the features work correctly. And they're there to give fast feedback to hold the developers accountable to the things they make. With each of these perspectives, there are different wants and needs. There are different areas of expertise and areas of weakness. But in traditional software shops, these roles have been highly siloed and separated. All right, there may be a team of business analysts or product owners separated from a team of developers, separated from a team of testers. I've worked in shops where developers will work and work and work and then literally throw their code over the walls to a tester and then move on to the next thing while the tester has to bang away trying to figure out what's working, what's broken. A lot of companies now are trying to break down these, but even there's still these inherent mental walls there, right? I've spent most of my time in the dev or test role, and I can admit personally, I don't always think like a product owner, right? They have gifts and talents and skills and insights that I lack, right? So it's hard for me to think like that, so I can miss things. So even if we put people on the same team, there can still be mental silos as well. And that can cause miscommunication as we try to explain things between each other. Ultimately, what we want to do is we want to recognize that these roles aren't these abstract, cold, empty silos, but rather these are people, right? These are people. They have insights, they have thoughts, they exercise agency and creativity, right? Everyone is on the same team. We're all trying to do the right thing for customers and build great products. And so what we want to do is we want to break down these silos, whether those are organizational or mental. And we need to see each other as these people, these individuals, individuals to be respected, to be, excuse me, to listen to try to understand, and to try to openly communicate and to share back and forth. That is where we can hopefully start to resolve problems with miscommunication. So how do we handle that? We already, like, pardon me, before COVID, right? A lot of times people would either have separate areas of the office, or they'd have walls or cubicles, right? Maybe they have open office. But now, even with COVID, it's even harder because everybody's working from home, and all we have are things like, screen share, like Zoom or High Five or whatever software you're using. So what the challenge here is bringing people together. So how can we do that? What I recommend is to schedule time together. Make sure that on your team, you are deliberately scheduling time intentionally to bring these three people in these three different roles together, right? Whether that's, some time, that you schedule once a week, Tuesdays from 2 to 4 o'clock, whether this is something you add on to your daily stand-ups every day, right? Whether, in office, if you just make sure that you shove all of your desks together, make sure that you're spending time across roles. That if you're a developer, you're not only talking to other developers. If you're a tester, you're not only talking to other testers. That you're having this cross-role collaboration. What I found is that when teams don't recognize these three amigos, so to speak, and they don't deliberately and intentionally set aside time to work together, that the collaboration is not going to happen, right? There needs to be someone, or a group of people to stand up and say, let's do this. Let's make sure that we are on the same page together. So what can the three amigos do together that they couldn't do apart? Here are some recommendations. First of all, asking questions, right? When we have miscommunications, it often goes like a game of telephone, where the first person says something and then the next person gets it, but they don't quite get the whole message. And then the third person, they're only getting a fraction of what the first person said. I see this very, very frequently, let's say within an Agile Scrum situation, where product owner says, hey, I want this new button on the page. And they write their ticket, their user story, put that new button there. User's going to mash it. It's going to spit out something pretty. Developer gets it. Okay, I got to put a new button on the page. Developer says, I'm going to put it on the top right of the page. But the product owner wanted it on the top left. That wasn't communicated. So then the tester gets it, and they're like, hey, this wasn't right. I thought it was going to be in the middle of the page. So the tester opens a bug ticket, goes back to the developer. Developer says, no, it's working as designed, close. Tester is tenacious and says, no, I don't think it's right. They go bring the product owner back. Product owner says, you're both wrong. So a whole 2-week sprint has been wasted building that button. If these three amigos had come together at the beginning of the sprint, and the tester or developer had just asked, hey, where do you want the button on the page? All that wasted time could have been avoided. They could have done it right from the beginning. So asking questions when you don't understand something, or you think you understand something and you need to reflexively listen to make sure that you do understand it. Other things three amigos can do, maybe brainstorming ideas. Hey, what if we tried this thing in our product, right? Hey, wouldn't it be cool if we did that thing over there? Having those three amigos together in a brainstorming session makes sure that one role does not lean too heavily into their strengths with blind spots for the other types of needs, right? Brainstorming is very healthy when you have multiple perspectives. Another thing these three amigos can do, maybe set aside time to discuss current and upcoming features. I hate it when product owners drop a whole bunch of new work that was completely unexpected. I don't like to be blindsided on my teams. So maybe these 3 Amigo sessions could be a time just to discuss, like, hey, what's coming down the pipeline? What are we thinking are going to be our next priorities? Maybe if I know that ahead of time, I can make sure that I schedule my work or to be prepared for it. Or maybe I can do some things in the product to set a nice platform for beginning that. 3 Amigos can also talk together to do story refinement or grooming, right? I know in Agile Scrum ceremonies, usually before a sprint, there's going to be a refinement meeting or a grooming meeting for the upcoming stories. That would be the perfect time to have biz, dev, and test sit together and say, hey, let's look at this so that when we go into our planning next week, we already know what's going on here, and we can hopefully expedite our planning meeting. They can also do other things like example mapping or writing behavior scenarios using Gherkin. We'll talk about 2 of those things a little bit later. Cool. So first problem, miscommunication. How do we solve it? Recognize that different roles bring different value to the table, and let's bring those roles together as people intentionally to collaborate. Let's break down those silos. Second problem we're going to talk about now is poor planning. Because when we bring the 3 Amigos together, we sort of beg the question, now what? Right? We've talked loosely about some things that the 3 Amigos could do together. Yeah, okay, so we set our meeting, our 3 Amigos meeting, Tuesday and Thursday afternoons at 3 o'clock. We're going to be intentional. We're going to make sure that we get the people together so we're not just sticking to ourselves and keeping our blinders on. But what I have found is just telling teams do the 3 Amigos doesn't really help them, because they get the 3 Amigos together and then they're like, well, now what? Everybody kind of stares at each other in the meeting. It's like, this is stupid. Why are we wasting our time? What is the purpose of this meeting? I find this acutely painful with traditional planning meetings in Agile. I feel oftentimes that when I'm in a planning meeting, it crushes my soul. Typically, my experience with planning meetings have been start of a new sprint every 2 to 3 weeks, come in, get your coffee, get your tea, get your breakfast, whatever, enter the meeting, a dozen people file in. And for the next 5.5 hours, the Scrum Master goes around the table for every single ticket. Okay, pull up the ticket. Here's this ticket. What's the user story? There's no user story. What's the acceptance criteria? There's no acceptance criteria. And the Scrum Master is talking to individual people one at a time, trying to extract information from them while everyone else is bored and playing around on their computer. And then once enough information is extracted about a ticket, we play this activity called planning poker, where you have everybody who hasn't been paying attention lift up what they are guessing the size of this story should be, which these point values are all arbitrary anyway. It's just what a team conforms a point to be through heuristics. And then when we all hold up our points, Scrum Master comes to me and says, now, Andy, I saw you held up an 8 and everyone else was holding up a 3. Why do you think that this story should have 8 points? And I say something like, well, first of all, we don't really know the entire scope of this because it wasn't well planned. Secondly, you didn't account for the testing work. And then there's more back and forth discussion. And eventually, the team will conform onto a given point size for that ticket, whether or not it was accurate. And then you repeat this and move on to the next ticket. And I don't know, maybe I'm a little bit cynical about this, but this has been my personal experience at multiple companies with multiple teams, that this seems to be the standard practice for how planning meetings go. And deep within my soul, I know that this can't be right. Why do we bring all these people together? You have the product owner, you have the testers, you have the developers, you have the 3 Amigos together. Yet the traditional way of going about planning and practice has been dismal, right? Maybe your teams are better than mine. Maybe y'all on your teams have, oh yeah, we do planning in like half an hour and it's easy. That's awesome. But in my experience, that's not the norm. So how can we fix these soul-crushing meetings, and specifically planning meetings? How can we get the most value out of the time the three amigos spend together? I'd like to introduce y'all to an activity called example mapping. Example mapping is a way that we can keep our discussions on track when we're talking about user stories and behaviors that we want to develop, and even test cases that we want to run or automate. Example mapping through this practice can keep our conversations focused, on topic, and insightful and interesting, rather than making them feel like we're trying to pull teeth, or we're all sitting in a room together staring at a screen, not knowing what to do for a given story or a given work item. So here's how example mapping works. It's pretty simple. All you need to get started is your group of three amigos and some sort of board to work with. Whenever I do this in person, typically I'm at a whiteboard with different color markers, or maybe I'm at a table and I have different color index cards with pens and pencils. Or now that we're doing things a lot over teleconferencing virtually, maybe you can just open up something like as simple as PowerPoint, or some sort of sketch program, or Microsoft Visio, whatever you need to kind of lay this out. The first thing we do with example mapping is we start with the user story, and we'll put that on a yellow card at the top of the board. Make sure that your user story is well formed. I like to use the format as a blank. I want blank so that blank. It puts perspective on the desired user or the target user. It gives them a desired action or behavior, and it provides the justification for that with a value statement. Interesting thing, I've been part of example mapping sessions where we stopped here because when we wrote the story card, we couldn't come up with a good value proposition. And so then we had to fall back on a question storming session to ask, what is this feature or behavior really trying to do? And does it even matter to our end users? So get your story, write it well, put it at the top of the board. This will be the one story we focus on for this round of example mapping. For step 2, we're going to then write rules that satisfy the user story on blue cards. Rules are meant to be kind of abstract. They're meant to be the things that, like I said, will satisfy the story. So for my story here, saying as a shopper, I want to put items to buy in a cart so I can hold them while shopping. Some rules to satisfy that could be things like items can be added to the carts. Items can be removed from the carts. And the item can carry up to 20 items total. Or sorry, the cart can carry up to 20 items total. Ultimately, these rules will become our story's acceptance criteria. And as we write out these rules, because we're doing it together as the three amigos, it offers a chance for everybody to have input into the story. And it gives people an opportunity to ask questions and to help refine what these rules are. Third, once we have our rules in place, we'll start illustrating them with concrete examples. Whereas the rules were rather abstract, the examples are meant to be specific and concrete. And we're going to write one-to-many examples for each rule on green cards, and we'll put them under the rules. You might think it's a little trivial to write examples once you have rules. But remember what I said about miscommunication before. Examples make things very clear, and they verify that everyone is thinking about behavior in the same way. So that when, let's say, I say items can be added to the cart, I can give 2 examples to say, okay, I'm going to add 1 item to an empty cart. Then I'm also going to have a scenario where I add multiple items to a cart that already has some items in it. right? That makes it very, very clear to say, there are multiple ways in which items can be added to the cart. And we're going to make sure that we carve out all the major cases of this behavior. And I've had times where everyone agrees on the story, everyone agrees on the rules, but then when you start writing examples, somebody raises their hand and say, actually, I thought it was supposed to work like this, and they write a different example. And then that generates really healthy discussion to say, oh, we didn't think of that, or, oh, there are two different ways we could do this. Let's decide which way we're going to do. Having those kinds of conversations earlier in your process, e.g. shift left, will save you much time and hassle and pain later when it's a little too late. So final part of this activity is what we call questions. As I said, this is meant to be a collaborative activity. Usually there's one scribe writing everything down, but then all the different people are engaging and talking and figuring things out together. But there are times where there are questions raised that cannot be answered during the example mapping session. For example, if we're talking about shopping carts, a question could be, well, what about duplicate items? What if I want 3 of the same item in my cart? Maybe that's something that, oh gosh, we didn't think of, and oh dear, it's too complicated to figure out in this example mapping session. What we can do is we can write that on a red card and set it aside. This is important because it does 2 things. First of all, it validates that the question is important. We're saying, okay, we want to have a space where people can ask questions. And when somebody asks a question that we just don't know the answer to, rather than ignore it, we want to make sure to say, yes, this is important. Let's not forget it. And the second thing is, when you write that question on a card and save it for later, now you have an artifact to go back to after, right? So you can say, okay, rather than derail our discussion that we're having, we can still make progress on these other rules and these other examples. But we don't want to go off on a tangent and waste all the time we have. So we'll put this on a card, and then after our example mapping session, we can assign somebody to do some research as a spike and answer that card later, and then come back to the group and share what that answer is. And maybe as a result of that, we have a 3 Amigos meeting. Maybe for that particular question, we have an example mapping session. Or maybe we were able to answer that question very well, and it becomes directly a new story. So stories, rules, examples, and questions. Those are the 4 parts of example mapping. What you want to do is you should probably take about 20 to 30 minutes per story and focus on one story. When teams are first getting started, they're not as used to example mapping yet, and so they may take from 30 to 60 minutes. But once y'all get good at it, you should really be targeting a 20 to 30 minute time frame. And the goal for example mapping is to make sure that every team member understands the story, right? And once we're done example mapping, we have artifacts from this practice that will help us with our future development process, right? We have the user story well-defined. Those rule cards become acceptance criteria for the story. The example cards ultimately will become behavior scenarios and test cases. And those questions will become spikes or future 3 Amigos meetings. Those cards are very, very helpful. A lot of times I've been in meetings where we do have 3 Amigos and we're talking about great things and we go off on great tangents and we really kind of figure things out together, and it's awesome. But nobody's writing anything down. And so 60% of that discussion is forgotten the next day. If you had these cards, you're not going to forget because you have the artifacts. You can dunk them right into, let's say, your Jira ticket if you're using Jira for your process. So example mapping, really, really helpful. Ultimately, what it does is it helps your team stop guessing and start really planning. For all the planning meetings I've been in, those soul-crushing meetings that I talked about before, I think I can retroactively look back and really rename them as guessing meetings. Because what did we do? We guessed what the scope of any given story would be. We guessed the actual size of the work that it would take to complete that story. We guessed what the acceptance criteria were. We didn't even guess usually what the test cases were. We left that up for some other poor tester or engineer the next week to figure that out, right? It's just organized guessing. What we really want, though, is true planning. And with example mapping, we get true planning. We all sit down and together figure out exactly what that story should be, right? Furthermore, we kind of get an inclination of what the size of that story is. Just count the number of cards. The more rules you have and the more examples you have represent more complexity and more work. And that's not something that's arbitrarily guessed with a game of poker planning. That's something that you actually wrote out yourselves. So example mapping, stop guessing, start planning. Third problem we'll cover tonight are deadlines. In my experience, and from what I've seen at other teams, I can bet that there is a 99% chance that in any given iteration, your team won't get everything done. There's going to be a story that slides. There's going to be a test that doesn't get automated. There's going to be something skipped or forgotten or broken. It's just what's going to happen. That's the way software development works. But why? Why can't we ever get everything done? Well, in any given iteration, whether this is a Scrum sprint or even some sort of waterfall phase, if you're in a more traditional software shop, there's a lot of stuff that needs to be done within an iteration. You look at your team and you realize, okay, this iteration, we gotta figure out the stuff that we're gonna do, right? Once we figure out the stuff, we gotta plan the stuff to make sure that we can do it on time. Now, once it's all planned, we gotta build the stuff. Then we got to test the stuff to make sure it's working. And when we find out it's not working, we got to refactor the stuff to make it work. We got to fix it along the way. Once we get tests running, we got to make sure we automate those tests for the stuff. Then to make sure we don't forget about the stuff in the future, we got to document it. And then we have to demo it to our product owners and potentially our customers. And then when it's all said and done, we have to put it in a box, wrap it up in a nice bow, and ship the stuff. That's a lot of stuff. It's a lot of stuff. So when we run out of time, what do? We don't do some of the stuff. And what is the stuff we typically don't do? Is the stuff in the middle. Usually, testing is first thing thrown out. Maybe refactoring, thrown out. Automation for tests, absolutely thrown out. Documenting stuff, who has time for that? Sometimes we can lie to ourselves and say, hey, we'll do it next sprint. We'll do testing and automation in sprint +1, or we'll just do it in the next phase. The .1 release, we'll get it that time. But we all know that's just piling up tech debt that is never really going to get done. But that's not good, because we know that we need to have solid testing. We know we want a robust automation or a robust suite of automated tests so that we don't always have to manually, clackety-clack on keyboards to make sure things work, right? These are all good things and important things. We shouldn't be skipping them. But we feel like we have to because we're always in a time crunch for these deadlines. So let's think a little bit smarter here. What if there's a way that we could try to optimize some of our process? And namely, I want to look on these bullet points here. Figuring out the stuff, planning, building, testing, automating, and documenting. Because these are all interrelated. All of these specific activities share specifications, right? Because figuring out stuff, we're writing the specification. Planning the stuff, we're refining the specification. Building the stuff and testing the stuff, we're following the specification. Same with automation. And with documentation, the spec is the doc. So maybe there's some efficiency we can get here to help us make sure we get all the stuff done. So I want to introduce you to this practice called specification by example. Specification by example clearly defines behaviors for development, testing, and automation as shared artifacts of our process. Remember from example mapping, when we had those rules and then we turned those into examples? Well, all of those examples are basically specification by example in rough form. What we can do is we can take those examples from example mapping and start to refine them a little bit to become really good, rich specifications. And one way we can do this is to rewrite our examples in this specification language called Gherkin. And then we can save them as what we call feature files. Here's what an example Gherkin feature file could look like for one of our shopping cart scenarios. My feature is the shopping cart, and I'll put my user story in here for documentation. And then under my feature section, I'm going to have one-to-many scenario sections. So here's an example of a scenario for one of our example carts. Scenario, add item to the cart. Given the cart has 5 items, when 8 items are added to the cart, then the cart contains 13 items. Gherkin is basically given, when, then. Given you have an initial state, when an action is taken, then verify outcomes. This is almost identical to the arrange act assert pattern, if you're familiar with that from unit testing. All I've done with our example is do a little bit of linguistic formality. I've given the scenario a title, I've organized its steps as given, when, then, but I've written the steps in plain language, right? Now, I can carry this forward through my process as a proof of purchase. This is my receipt. If we did the example mapping and then turn that into the specification, then I can say, aha, this is what we all agreed to develop. So the developer can read this and say, got it, this is what I'm gonna build. Tester can say, got it, this is what I'm gonna test, right? It eliminates that miscommunication, right? It brought the 3 amigos together through these helpful practices, and now we have something that we can really, really use. And now we know, even though we front-loaded our process with a little bit of extra work, the actual implementation and testing of this is really straightforward. So why do we use examples again? Well, people understand real-world examples much better than they understand abstractions, right? We're trying to eliminate the confusion. If I can show an example of somebody adding things to a shopping cart or removing things from a shopping cart, then we're all going to understand better exactly how the shopping cart should work. Now, why specifically do I want to use Gherkin, right? I mean, we could just write a paragraph, right? Wouldn't that be good specification? It would be, but if you write it in Gherkin, you get a really, really nifty advantage here that's even more efficiency. Right? These scenarios that we write in Gherkin are essentially test cases. They're not just specification. They're also test cases, right? Those given, when, then steps, you could give to a manual tester and they can follow along and just run them. Or you could give them to an automation engineer. And together with a BDD framework like Cucumber or SpecFlow, they will be able to turn this Gherkin specification into an automated test case. That Gherkin is essentially like a test script, right? And so a framework like Cucumber or SpecFlow will just link those given, when, then steps in plain language to methods or functions in your programming language of choice, whether that's Java, C#, Python, Ruby, what have you. And so you can essentially build these acceptance tests using automation, using the same Gherkin specification, using the same examples that you mapped, right? It's all the same. And what I have found with BDD test frameworks, right? Why I love to use them is that these Gherkin steps are reusable. Think about this. In how many of your test cases do you need to log into the application? And how many of the test cases do you need to perform a simple search or a simple navigation, right? Testing is very, very repetitive. We do a lot of the same steps over and over again. And a lot of it are the common basic core behaviors of our product or feature that we're testing, right? Yeah, there's going to be some edge cases. Yeah, there's going to be new steps you have to write for very specific behaviors. But there's also a lot of stuff that you're going to reuse. And so since these Gherkin steps are reusable, right? When I go and automate new tests, using new Gherkin scenarios that are reusing existing steps, I can automate these tests a whole lot more quickly, right? You know, the first step or the first test, let's say it's 3 steps long, right? Given one then, that's all going to be new. But let's say the second test that I have to automate uses the same given step that the first test did. Now I only have to automate 2 new steps instead of 3. The more and more you automate, the more and more steps you're going to find you reuse. I've hit it where I've been able to automate new test cases with Gherkin without having to touch any programming code, simply because steps already exist for me. And I just have to change the parameters a little bit to get them to exercise new behaviors or organize them in a new way. This is what I call the automation snowball, where you can automate new tests rapidly once you hit your stride. So that's another great reason why, along with these BDD practices, you know, going from resolving problems in collaboration now to resolving problems in automation. Why? All we did were just formalize the artifacts we share through our process, and we're getting great advantage. So let's tie things together here. We've looked at 3 major software problems tonight. For miscommunication, we saw how we can solve those problems with 3 Amigos collaboration. With poor planning, we saw how we can solve that with example mapping. And with deadlines, we saw how we can optimize our process using specification with automation. This is what I would consider to be true behavior-driven development, right? Like I said before, rather than give you a definition to begin with, I'd rather show you than tell you. And so all these I would consider to be behavior-driven development practices. If I were to give you a definition of behavior-driven development, I would define it like this. BDD is a set of pragmatic practices that puts software behaviors first. Why do we want to put software behaviors first? Because your users do, right? The users don't care what's in your database. They don't care exactly what test cases you ran on the back end. What they care about is that they can use the software product you're delivering to them, and it brings value to them. And they interact with that product through the different behaviors, things like logging in, loading a page, uploading something, downloading something, searching for something, purchasing something. Those are all the behaviors. And so in our development process, if we look at those behaviors, if we put most of our focus on those behaviors as we develop, we bring together the 3 amigos who have different perspectives on these behaviors to collaborate to make the best behaviors possible. If we use activities like example mapping to really think before we code as to what the behavior should be, and then if we use practices like specification with automation, that we can optimize the delivery or the development and testing and delivery of these behaviors, making sure they stay on point with what we thought they should be. And also, by that way, building this amazing automated regression suite of tests that will protect those behaviors from regressions in the future. Then ultimately, not only do we have a better software development process, but we ultimately build better software products. Put behaviors first because your users do. So there's many, many benefits to BDD, and I'm sure you've probably, picked out quite a few as I've been talking tonight. Classically, people will say the 2 main benefits of BDD are better collaboration and better automation, as we've seen. There's a host of other benefits. Like today, I've talked about how there's efficiency in the process. You spend more time doing certain things at first, but ultimately those are things that you need to be doing anyway. So shift left and do them early before they become too costly to do or change later. You also get efficiency in how you develop your test automation code, which is really nice. You also get traceability throughout the whole process. The BDD process that we've seen takes you from ideation to implementation with automation. And you can trace every single step along the way because you have the artifacts, such as the example mapping cards, such as the Gherkin specification, such as the test automation with the product that's implemented. And finally, you get accountability, right? When you have these specifications that you're developing or that you're writing for the things you're developing, they act as your proof of purchase. You can say, hey, we said we were going to build this, but the product that was delivered doesn't actually do this. And you can see it fails here with this test. The team can hold itself accountable to make sure they're building the right things that are actually valuable to the customer. So that's a lot. Thank you so much for listening to my talk tonight. There's more on BDD than I can possibly share in a 1-hour webinar. So if you want to learn more, you can check out my website, automationpanda.com/BDD. I have a whole page on behavior-driven development. You can also reach out to me anytime through the contact form on my blog or on Twitter. I'd be more than happy to discuss things about BDD, testing, and automation with y'all. So with that, I guess it's time for some questions and answers.
Yeah, Andy, thank you so much for that. That was a super fantastic presentation. I myself have seen a lot of BDD presentations, and this one gave at least me a really good understanding about what to do, when, and why. I've never seen such good detail about, especially the collaboration planning aspects of it. Usually it's so focused around the tool and not so much focused about this, and that was really great. I see a lot of potential benefits from it.
Oh, glad to hear that.
Yeah. So anyway, we've got tons of questions here, lots of really great questions. Let me start firing them at you.
Sure.
The first one here, I'm sure you will nail all of them. The first one here is, should people use BDD automation tools if they don't follow the BDD process?
Oh, I have opinions on this. that are out of the mainstream. Okay, so here we go. If you follow the BDD purists, people like from the Cucumber Company, and I don't want to like name names or anything, but like the people who are like, leading, the ones writing Cucumber books and all this stuff, they would say, no, you should never use a BDD test automation tool outside of doing the BDD processes because it's extra garbage on top. The Gherkin's just going to get in the way and it's going to slow you down. And you really just want to get into code and automate. You don't need that. My answer is I find great value in BDD test automation frameworks, even apart from the BDD processes or the practices that we've looked at. And here's why. When I develop test automation solutions, and I'm talking about coded solutions, you're doing something in Java or C# or whatever, and I'm talking about feature level test automation solutions, not unit tests. So things like testing web apps or testing like REST APIs or stuff like that, where you're really getting like heavy behaviors you're automating. Your test automation solution has got to have layers, right? And so at the very top layer, you've got your test cases. Next layer down, you've got test support. That's usually your core framework that's lining up your tests like dominoes, knocking them over and reporting on it. Below that, you have your product support. Those are all the interactions with the product under test. So things like your page objects, or if you're making screenplay calls, those kinds of things. Below that, you've got your automation support. That's going to be all the plumbing for your solution. Things like logging or assertions, or third-party libraries like Selenium WebDriver itself. Right. Sandwiched in between all that, you're also going to have your config support layer, which is all the inputs you have to read that point at whatever environment you're at. Now, the reason I am going off on this trip about these automation or test automation solution layers is because test automation is complicated. You need these layers. And like I said, at the very top, you have test cases separated from test support and the lower layers. I love BDD test automation frameworks because it separates test cases from test code. BDD frameworks separate test cases from test code, right? When I write my test cases, even if I'm not, doing any automation or whatever, I'm writing them in given when then format, right? I'm very opinionated on what good Gherkin is. I'm doing that anyway, right? Because I'm specifying atomic tests with given when then that focus on unique individual behaviors. And I can write that in plain language in Gherkin, right? And when I write that in Gherkin, I can take it to my developer and say, hey, is this what we're thinking? Yes or no? I can take it to my product owner who doesn't even know how to code. Show them the test case. Yes or no? Later, when that test fails in my continuous integration system and the test report poops out, hey, this test failed, I copy and paste the gherkin and put that in the bug report, right? Doesn't need any test code. Separate your test case from your test code. So now that I've spent all my time thinking about what a good test case is and spent my time writing that well in Gherkin so it is specified and communicated, right? My next step then is going to be it's almost like an afterthought. Now I'm going to go automate this thing. And so if I have a BDD framework, right? Oh, I just put the Gherkin in my feature file and then boom, I write my Java or my C# or my Python methods. I'm good to go, right? That test case doesn't have to be translated into Java or C#. The Gherkin exists for what it is, right? You know, I can't go into, let's say, an end unit test case and like scrape the contents out and send it to my product owner and say, we have a bug here. Doesn't work, right? You know, that there's no separation of test case and test code when you're using a more traditional test automation framework, right? So yes, I find great value in using a BDD test framework outside of the BDD processes, because even if it's not solving my collaboration problem, it is solving my automation problem, right? I still will be able to know what my test cases are, that they're valuable, right? I'm going to force them to be atomic. I'm still going to hit that automation snowball because I'm able to reuse my Gherkin steps. I'm going to be able to separate and abstract out my layers of my test automation solution with good design. So it's going to be maintainable and scalable in the future. I've written an entire article about it. If you go to Google and you search behavior-driven blasphemy, you will hear me say all of these things. And I will assert, I'm not the only one who thinks these things either, right? I think the reason why Cucumber and SpecFlow and all these Gherkin-based test automation frameworks became so almost violently popular in our industry, separated from good BDD practices, was because people saw value in the fact that they provided an off-the-shelf domain-specific language for test automation that they could customize, right? That's why people like loved to use Cucumber at first, because they were like, aha, it solves the problem of I can do more test automation by specifying less if I do these steps well, right? And to hell with any other BDD practice, like I get value out of this just from the technical advantage of it being a domain-specific language, right? And companies like, there's one here in where I live in North Carolina called Tryon Solutions. They developed a BDD test tool that's primarily targeting like big supply chain enterprise, where they're writing their supply chain test cases in given when then, and it's called Cycle Automation is the tool. They've actually, not only do they have the given when then tool, but they've actually given, you know, out of the box steps for things like web UI and console scraping, so that these business oriented customers can just literally pick up and use a Gherkin like language to write their test cases, and boom, it's automated. So that is my opinion, and I'm sticking to it.
That was really awesome, Andy. I totally can see and understand everything that you've talked about. It definitely makes absolute sense. I don't know if you've read or anyone online has read the book Clean Code by Uncle Bob, and also there's Clean Architecture. And what he basically says is that all software, and automated testing is software, breaks down into two things: the specification and the implementation. That's it. There is the specification that the end user interacts with, and then there is the implementation that constantly changes. And so if we think about that context in terms of test automation, what are the specs in test automation? Well, that is the test cases. Hence, so I myself have been kind of anti-BDD because I only see it misused. Experts like Andy show us really good ways to do it. And the potential, I think, if implemented well, of BDD can be extremely powerful. If we implement our specs can live forever. And kind of as Andy said, the implementation details will change, but that's kind of impossible to prevent anyway.
Indeed.
Cool. Let's continue here. We got a few more. So here someone asks, how would you propose the BDD approach to a team? In my case, I'm trying to implement it at my company, but people are very resistant to it. And maybe, sorry, Andy, sorry to interrupt. Maybe because it's the same person, maybe they're trying to add on to that question. So do you have any recommendations on articles, videos, etc., to prove the benefits of BDD to convince people?
Oh, great question. I get this question all the time. And I've been in the position of trying to convince others in my team or my organization to adopt more BDD practices. So here's the advice I would give there, right? Your goal is not to pitch or sell BDD, right? That's kind of what I was saying earlier with the buzzwords, right? You try to throw a buzzword in somebody's face, what they're going to be like, I don't want to change. Screw that. Different thing, change, new work, overhaul what I'm doing, mess up my jive. No. What you want to do is you want to demonstrate value, right? Look for problems on your team that you think BDD practices could solve and start to zero in on them. For example, if you are, let's say, doing like Agile Scrum and like 2 or 3 sprints in a row, you've been assigned tickets that have not been well groomed, and maybe there's been missing acceptance criteria, or you started doing the ticket and you found out the scope was actually double in size of what it was originally thought to be. Then you can maybe have a conversation with your Scrum Master, or maybe just go directly to a product owner and a developer and say, hey, listen, we've had some issues here where we haven't groomed our stories well. I've heard of this practice called example mapping that can kind of help us figure that out sooner rather than later. Maybe we can try it, and just, pull aside some people and just start doing it. I've seen that be very successful. Or like where I work at Precision Lender, I started there 2.5 years ago. When I started, I was the first software engineer in test. I was basically the first engineer who was not just a generic software engineer. I was the first one with a specialty. And my charter was to come in and build a testing and automation practice from the ground up. Their only testing that they would do would be deployed to their developer environment, log in and check. There were no manual tests. There was no test automation. There were unit tests, but no like feature level test automation. And so my first big project was building a test automation solution. And so I chose to build it using C#, SpecFlow, Selenium WebDriver, and REST Sharp. The other language of choice was Python, and it pained me that we didn't choose that, but it was the right decision for Precision Lender. We can talk about that some other time. But I opinionatedly chose SpecFlow from the beginning. First of all, because I think SpecFlow is freaking amazing. I love the SpecFlow framework. I think it's very mature. It's got a lot of great features, but also specifically because SpecFlow is a BDD framework. You write your test cases in Gherkin feature files, and you link them to C# step definitions. Now, at this time, nobody in my company had ever even heard the term behavior-driven development, but I knew what it was, and I knew what benefits it could bring. And so my I don't want to say it was like my strategy, but like my thought was, okay, I'm going to introduce value in the automation space with behavior-driven practices using a BDD test automation framework. And so we built a project, and we added tests, and it started growing, and we made sure it grew well. And we used good Gherkin, and we used good test automation design. We used the screenplay pattern. And so when we were able to demonstrate success with a test automation solution that had a BDD component to it, then I can start to open up the conversation with people and say, hey, this is what BDD is all about, right? And so it was probably like 1.5 to 2 years, but before other people started really trying some BDD practices, right? Now, like once we demonstrated success with the automation framework, then it was, okay, let's talk about example mapping, because we're starting to have some problems with keeping up with automating new tests with new features. It'd be helpful to know kind of what thing to help plan things a little bit better ahead of time. Let's try to do some example mapping sessions for maybe these new features for this thing that's upcoming. And we'll just do example mapping on those with a small group, and we'll see how it goes. It was great. Now example mapping is a standard practice for our team. It's like, oh, well, why aren't we doing example mapping for this? Why aren't we writing, SpecFlow tests to go along with this new feature? Like, all because we demonstrated success for the problems that were at hand that people were feeling. And I mean, it's not about BDD. This is really about common sense, right? I think BDD is common sense. And so I'm going to use these kinds of sensible, pragmatic practices to resolve the problems that people are having. And okay, well, now you've landed on BDD. Boom.
Awesome. Thanks, Andy. All right. Are you okay to do a few more questions?
Oh, of course. I've got time.
Oh, awesome. Sounds good, man. All right. So Valerie asks, is there a tool you have used or recommend for companies that are remote? And then I asked her to expand on that while you were talking, because I figured there might be a little confusion. She said about example mapping, the planning meeting that was discussed. Sure.
I have yet to find a good example mapping tool, unfortunately. There is one, Team Up Labs. I think they're still out there. They're kind of like remote example mapping. They have a good thing. I would presume that the Cucumber tools are or somehow have example mapping in there. Cucumber just got bought by SmartBear, I believe, and I know SmartBear has been investing heavily. Like they merged Cucumber Pro and Hip Test, and they're trying to do a whole bunch of new stuff there. So I haven't used any of those tools, but my gut tells me they probably have an example mapping thing. So yeah, sorry. I wish I could give a better suggestion for something other than Team Up Labs, or maybe look at Cucumber tools.
And probably, correct me if I'm wrong, you could probably use just something simple like some kind of a mapping tool where like you create like an org chart, right? And just throw on boxes and just look at the screen share and talk about it as a team.
Exactly. I mean, here's another thing that I've done that's works decently well. In more recent versions of the Cucumber test framework, the Gherkin language has been updated to use example mapping language. So traditionally, a Gherkin feature file would be feature example, right? Feature example, or sorry, scenario. Feature scenario, scenario, scenario. The new format of Gherkin supports feature or story, rule, and then example, example, example. So you could, fire up like a Gherkin editor and screen share and just, write out or type out in text. Okay, here's my story. Here's rule number 1. Here are the examples for it. Here's rule number 2. Here are the examples for it. You could approach it that way too. It doesn't need to be high tech. It can be very simple.
But high tech is so much fun.
High tech costs so much money.
I know, yeah, it does.
Sorry.
Oh yeah.
I don't hide my opinions.
So true, man. So true. I like to keep things agile as well. All right. Got another question from Valerie. She says, by dedicating 20 to 30 minutes per story seems a lot when there is a lot that is required to be delivered in the sprint. Do you feel that you have been able to ship out the same exact amount of work with this example mapping than without it?
Yes. And what I would say to that is all the things to be done in example mapping, or all the things that you do in example mapping, ultimately need to be done at some point when you develop, right? Y'all need to get on the same page. Y'all need to figure it out. Y'all need to plan it out. And then y'all need to do the testing, right? If you don't do any of those activities, then you're opening up yourself to a lot of risk when you go to ship, that the quality is poor, there's bugs, or it's the wrong thing. So it may seem like you spend a lot of time front loading your process with this, but ultimately I believe you're going to save more time in the long run. What we've seen on my team at Precision Lender, we start small. We didn't start doing example mapping for every single story. We did like 1 or 2 per sprint. But there have been times where it's like, we did an example mapping session, got through it, learned a lot. And afterwards, one of the developers told me, listen, man, if we didn't do this, I was going to go work for the next week implementing the wrong thing. This half-hour activity just saved me a week's worth of work. So boom, there's that. Or like I've been in example mapping sessions where, like I said before, we stopped on the user story because we could not justify business value. And instead we fell into a bunch of questions, wrote a bunch of question cards, and then sent it to the product owners to do some customer research. So, rather than have a developer add some new widget on the board that may not have been worth anything, stop and think before we code. So you're going to save time that way.
That's awesome, man. You know where you got me, and I had kind of an epiphany moment about BDD is where you talked about where you do have to have these conversations regardless. I've worked on one team where I was the tester, and it worked really well, but we would have these conversations that you talked about. We would just have them live. We'd have the product owner that we'd hit up through Slack or whatever, and I'd have the developer, and we'd just all be talking. But at some point, I did have to write those requirements down, convert them into what I understand, and then at some point convert them into automated tests as well. So I was doing that activity anyway, and I could have misinterpreted things, and no one else really saw that, right? So it kind of makes sense that you're going to do it regardless if you want to do a good job, so might as well just document it and do it together.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, I mean, y'all can play fast and loose, You can be like, well, maybe I'm not going to take the time to sit down and really plan all this out, Oh, we'll just let the tester figure out what the tests are on their own time, and we'll just trust that it works, right? You can play fast and loose, and it may feel like you're moving fast, but ultimately the consequences will catch up, right? I want to live in a world where I do things the right way. Slow and steady wins the race. Okay, it may feel a little bit slow at first, but I believe in high quality, right? High quality workmanship, high quality products, high quality features, high quality process. And I want to make sure that we do things the right way. And so take the time to do it right.
Awesome. Andy, do you have time for a few more questions? I think there's just one more remaining.
Let's roll. Let's get them done.
All right. So Radig asks, who's responsible for writing these Gherkin artifacts, like Scrum Master, product owner?
Great question. My answer to that is it depends. It really depends on what your team's practices are, how you're structured, how you're dividing labor. I'll give some suggestions here. So if you and your team were to adopt the different practices that I've described tonight, you identify 3 amigos, schedule them, bring them together, start talking about things. For planning, start doing some example mapping, and then formalizing examples into Gherkin and then automating them. What can work really well is that you have a 3 amigos meeting where you do an example mapping session, and then you get your examples down, and then somebody, maybe the tester, maybe the developer, maybe the product owner, will take the examples and turn them into Gherkin and then share them back with the group a little bit later for review, right? Kind of like an offline activity. Okay, everybody goes back to their desk. Maybe it can be a divide and conquer. I'll take these, you take those, and then we'll come back and just make sure everything looks good and we're all lined up on step names. If you aren't doing something like that, like for example, when I first started at Precision Lender, I was a one-man team on my test automation island doing spec flow, woo, And so I was the one who was writing all the Gherkin. Why? Because at that time it was very, very closely tied to the automation. And so it made sense for me as the test role to write the Gherkin myself. Now I still had it reviewed with developers as part of code review, but product owners didn't really start seeing Gherkin until probably at least a year into that project when I started opening bugs and dropping Gherkin scenarios as the repro steps. So I mean it depends. Here's another thing you could do. You could have the 3 amigos do mob programming to write Gherkin, where everybody writes the Gherkin together. Find what works for you and your team. That's what I would say. Okay, good stuff, Andy. I think that's all the questions. So with that, I just wanted to say thanks so much for joining us here today to everyone, and especially for Andy for such fantastic information and an excellent session on BDD. Really appreciate your time, and thanks again, everyone, and see you all next time. Thank you, everybody.